to Childhood Learning Bites. Heidi Mendenhall, your guest host, excited to talk to you about our multilingual and dual language learners. We are digging into the difference between simultaneous and sequential bilingual learners. We're going to think about what that means for us as caretakers and educators and how we can best support our students and our children that are learning more than one language. So, a sequential learner is a child who is learning two languages, learned one language earlier in their life, and is learning a second language later on. And actually, that child can be learning many more than two languages. It can be 3 languages, 4 languages, 5 languages. But the definition is that the child was exposed to one language fully at birth. They were spoke to, they were talked in motherese, they were sang to, they had the sing-songy voice and all the little cute little songs that we sing, right? And they had all of that in one primary language. And then later in their life, maybe when they were 2, maybe when they were 5, maybe when they were 15, they were exposed to a second language or a third language and a fourth language, right? And so, for example, our children that come to us that maybe just moved here to an area that speaks English, maybe they moved from another part of the country, maybe they moved from another country, maybe they were living in one family home that spoke primarily Hmong, and then they moved to another family home where there were multiple English speakers and family members who spoke Hmong, and now they're learning 2 languages, right? But at the beginning, at their very earliest phase of language development, when they were born, they were exposed primarily to one language. So, for example, my daughters are primarily exposed to English, and now they are learning Spanish, right? They are exposed secondarily to Spanish when they were about 1.5, 2 years old, but not at equal levels, right? So they're a sequential learner. I also am a sequential learner. I learned Spanish in high school. Another type of dual language learner or multilingual learner is what we call simultaneous. And simultaneous learner means that they learned both languages at the exact same time. Remember I talked about how if you're learning one home language, then you probably were sang to, and you had the sweet little voice and up, down, sing song, right? These are just these innate things that we do to teach children language, because as babies we're primed to just listen and look at all those sounds. For a child that's a simultaneous learner, they had that in 2 languages or maybe 3 languages, right? And this is critical because sometimes we think we're simultaneous learners because, well, we've been exposed to English through TV and songs, and my older sister speaks English, but really the bulk of the language was maybe Punjabi, and that was what mom and dad and aunt and uncle and 2 siblings, but it was just one sibling who was speaking English. Well, that's not true simultaneous learner, right? Simultaneous learner is 2 strong bases of language, right? Really strong bases of language. And for a simultaneous learner, we actually can tell when we look at their brain, because their brain develops a little bit different and the structures look a little bit different. So how they process language is different, meaning how the synapses and what it looks like in their brain is different. This is really simplistic, but the way I think about it is I'm a sequential learner. So when I process, I have information going in, I have to do some translation to get it to a second language. Then I have to make connections in the words that I know in that second language. Then I have to translate it back to my home language. Then in my home language, English, I make connections to existing knowledge to make meaning, and then I can output, right? So I have this kind of longer processing time, whereas a simultaneous learner, you might not see that as much. So when we're thinking about how to support simultaneous versus sequential learners in a classroom, we want to be aware of the different phases of development that each goes through, right? For a simultaneous learner, we want to be really mindful that we're providing opportunity in both languages for them to process, play, produce, and receive language. Now, those 4 things actually are really critical for all children, right? So for our sequential learners, we want them to do that as well. But for our sequential learners, while we're giving them opportunities to process, play, produce, and receive in all languages, we're watching for some specific stages of development. They go through some typical phases that can tell us a little bit about how they're processing language. So for sequential learners, there are 4 phases of development. And the first we call home language phase. The home language phase is typically where children are producing home language, right? They are really getting used to using their home language in our classroom, in our environment, in our childcare setting, and we primarily hear them speaking and talking in that first language. Now that does not mean they're not absorbing like little sponges all that second, third, and fourth language that we are producing, or exposing them to, but what we're observing is them producing home language. So it's really mindful that we notice this, we watch for it, because there's 2 things that happens. One, as a teacher, sometimes you have a bias towards leaning towards the children that you speak the same language with. So if you don't speak the same language as that child and they're in the home language phase, you want to give extra attention to that child, because chances are if you don't put extra intent on it, you might naturally not. The second phase of sequential development is called the observation stage. Now, this stage is when they are beginning to produce a little bit, but they are really looking. The observation phase, also sometimes called the listening phase, is when they're really just noticing and watching what's going on. Now, they might produce a little bit, and especially some very powerful phrases, like they might say, my turn, right? Or it's mine, right? They start to use some of the language that is very necessary on the playground, necessary for being able to get what they need in the learning environment, and things that they hear over and over again. One of my favorite things to do with this phase is to begin to play board games that don't require a lot of language output. So like Spot It, or memory. These are things that you can engage and play in really low intense settings, so that there's not a lot of pressure on language output, but you get to repeat language over and over again, like my turn, or spot it, or see it, or found it, and so you're really getting to practice some of these simple phrases while not requiring a lot of pressure. It's also really important for the observational/listening stage for teachers and educators to acknowledge the work that is happening here. Like, imagine the work that goes into observing and noticing all the new language around you, right? Especially for a brain that's already primed to observe and notice all the language around you without learning more than one language, right? And so honoring this and giving time and knowing that there is so much going on for that child is really critical. The third language stage in the sequential learners is telegraphic. So remember I said in that listening or observing, they're starting to just use a little bit of language, like a little bit of that second language, right? They use a lot of language, a lot of home language, but a little bit of that second language or third language. In telegraphic, they're using even more, but it's very rote, it's very repetitive. It's an expansion of some of those phrases like I like it, or it's mine, or I go now, or I want milk, I need milk, right? Very short and very to the point, right? Very to get something, to get their needs met. And so this is really critical, because we have an opportunity as educators to reinforce their power of using language to get their needs met, and we want to meet their needs. So we want to really be listening, we want to really be honoring, right? We want to really be taking an opportunity to feedback and expand on the language that they're giving us, but honoring that they tried. So if they say like, I need milk, you might say, oh, you're ready for milk now? All right, I'll give you some milk now. I'll fill your cup all the way to that 1 cup line, right? And so you're just reinforcing all that language back to them, right? But not correcting that they maybe didn't do it grammatically perfect, right? Because really what 4-year-old does, and we know for all 4-year-olds, we don't want to be correcting their grammar. We just want to be offering an expansion of the grammar they use. Okay. The fourth stage, which we call fluid language, right? And fluid is where we're really working on fluency, right? Now, it's not fully fluent, because there is no 4-year-old, 5-year-old, 6-year-old, 7-year-old that is fully fluent, right? We're always developing language. But fluid means that they're really starting to produce and utilize language in a much more fluid and meaningful way, no longer just to get their needs met, but to connect and engage. And there's something I forgot to say about the telegraphic stage that's really important. and it kind of bleeds over into the fluid stage, which is we sometimes can overestimate the type of language a child has or the stage that they're in, specifically with telegraphic, because they're so good at getting their needs met that we assume that they have more language. And sometimes I hear things like, well, I know they have more language, I hear it on the playground. Like, well, they're using it on the playground to get their needs met. That doesn't mean they have an expansive vocabulary in that second language yet. And so we always want to remember that these kiddos are doing the very best that they can. So if we want to see more language production in the second language, we need to give more opportunities to support home language and more opportunities for them to practice and play with language. So it's a lot of information, right? 2 types of learners, 4 stages in the sequential learner. I hope this gives you a little bit of information, a little bit of insight. I hope you take a minute to just notice your dual language learners and your multilingual learners and be reflective. Ask yourself if you can observe and notice what developmental phase they're in. And if you haven't taken the time to really get to know these families, hop back to our last episode on dual language and multilingual learning, and I talk about 3 questions that are really critical to ask so that you can best support them. Thank you for the work you do, and thanks for joining us.